And then let's get the share screen up. All right, can everybody see that? Yay, nay?
Yes.
Yes, cool. All right. Well, today's topic, I'll move our little side screen over here. Today's topic is the Bible in Context part. I think it is supposed to be 23. I think I messed up. I think I left, I didn't change it from last week. But the question that we're trying to answer today is, did Jesus read the Septuagint? And for those of you that don't know, is the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament. It also includes the ones Septuagints we see. They include books like the Apocrypha, which are like books that we don't accept nowadays, like stuff we don't have in our Bibles. But the question is, the question was brought up last class because we were talking. Brother, I think it was Brother Parker that mentioned how Jesus quoted a lot from the Septuagint version of the Bible and not the original Hebrew. And so I didn't really know much about it, so I did a lot of research on it and everything. And I think I have a pretty clear narrative of what was happening and the perception and things like that. So we're gonna get into it today and talk about did Jesus read the Septuagint, and if he did, what are the implications for that? Good morning, Brother Parker. Just see you came in. Good to see you.
Good. How's everybody?
Pretty good. All right, so let's start off with this. The Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? The Septuagint is a term that comes from a Latin phrase, and I don't speak Latin, so I'm not going to attempt to do it, but it simply means translation of the 70 interpreters. And we're going to get into the origin story of the legend of how it was actually originally formed, of how the original Septuagint was formed, but it has a reference to 70 interpreters. Those are the people who actually wrote the Greek version, the Septuagint of the Old Testament. But we're going to get into that story a lot later down in the slideshow. Now, it is the basis for Catholic and Eastern Orthodox scripture, or their ideology. A lot of them have pieces of the Septuagint. I think there are differences between the Roman Catholic, I think, has fewer books, and then I think the Orthodox has more books, or vice versa. So there is some differences between their Septuagint and the Orthodox Septuagint, but their Old Testament is based on the Septuagint version, and ours, what we read here in the West, we read just based on the Hebrew canon, the Hebrew version of the Bible. The Septuagint has some differences, different added books that we don't read today, we don't accept. Now, to begin with, we know that Jesus read in the synagogues. We know that he quoted scripture a lot and things like that. And, he was very active in the Jewish community. And I think the fear is that if he's reading the Septuagint, are we, the way we're practicing Christianity nowadays, do we have a complete picture? Are we doing everything right? And if he's not, are we kind of okay? What was Jesus reading? What is he reading the same thing we're reading nowadays? Because if Jesus wasn't reading the Septuagint, then we're okay, because that just means Jesus was reading the Hebrew Bible. That's what we read. Our version is in English, of course, for our language purposes. But that means if Jesus did not read the Septuagint, we don't have anything to worry about. We're reading the exact same scripture that Jesus is, because he's not reading the Greek version. But if he did read the Septuagint, then the fear is that we may be leaving out certain scriptures, because the Septuagint contains, a few more books that the Hebrew Bible does not have. So that is the fear that we have that we may be leaving out certain scriptures that we should be reading, but we're not because we don't accept the version, the Greek version of the Old Bible. And if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, and I'll put it on I'm gonna pull it up on my phone app. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give. So the Bible puts a big emphasis on, you don't add anything or you don't subtract anything. If Jesus did not read the Septuagint and he just read the Hebrew Bible, then we're good because we're not adding anything that's not supposed to be there. But if Jesus did read the Septuagint, then the fear is that we may be leaving out stuff. That means we're subtracting, and that will put us in violation of that scripture. That is the fear we have. It also says pretty much the same thing in Revelation chapter 22, and I'll go ahead and read that also. 22, verse 18 and 19. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this scroll. If anyone adds anything to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in the scroll. And if anyone takes away from the scroll of prophecy, God will take away from the person any share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this scroll. So the point I'm trying to get to is that, we need to know what version of the Bible was Jesus reading, what books was he reading, do we have a complete picture? Because we don't want to put ourselves in violation with the rest of the Bible. We don't want to leave anything out, but we don't want to add anything either. So we need to make sure we get this right. This is very important for us to do that. So the question I asked myself based on our last class, did Jesus read the Septuagint? And that was the question I was trying to answer in my preparation for this class this week. I was just studying. I was like, did Jesus read the Septuagint? What versions of the Bible is he reading? Is he reading Greek? Is he reading Hebrew? Is he reading something else? So after all the research I did, the answer I kind of came up with is yes and no. And I'm going to explain why I say yes and why at the same time I say no to answer this question. And I hope the way I explain it you'll get what I'm trying to come from. But right now it's kind of, from the research I've done so far, it's yes and it's no. But let's get into the yes part. Why I say yes, he read the Septuagint. Now, before I go any further, any questions so far? Is everybody's clear on what we're trying to answer for today? Any comments so far?
I have a question, and maybe you're going to address this. So when was the Septuagint written?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, we are going to get into that. So, don't want to answer now?
No,
give me a few moments. We'll answer.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we'll answer that. Yeah, we're going to get into that because it seems like it would be a straightforward answer, but it's really not. So, but we'll get into that. Any other comments or questions before we continue? All right, and yeah. So we're going to answer that question in a little bit. Now, Jesus, if you're familiar with the old, with the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus grew up in Galilee. Now, at this time, under Roman occupation, because the land of Israel was under Roman rule when Jesus was born. Galilee is divided into Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. Jesus, being born in Nazareth, was raised in Lower Galilee, and then also we hear the Sea of Galilee. Let me get my laser pointer up. I like my red laser pointer. There we go. The Sea of Galilee is right here. This is when it talks about when Jesus goes on, one boat to another, or like he goes across the water. It is this area right here. So this is roughly, just kind of the area that Jesus starts off his life in, where he lives, and then he does his ministry where he travels around. Now, Galilee, specifically that region, was very culturally diverse. To begin with, they had Roman occupation, so the Romans are there. Now, the Jews did try to separate themselves. From what I could tell from the Romans, they generally did not try to, you know, they try to keep their own culture, and they try to keep separate from the Romans. But Romans being there, you're going to have Roman influence, whether they want to or not. They also had a lot of Hellenistic culture, and if y'all remember from our last class, we talk about how the Greeks took over with Alexander and everything, and how there was a lot of successor kingdoms that came out of that. And before the Romans came, you had a lot of Greek influence in this area to the point where the most common language spoken in that area was probably Greek. That's how it was like the English for them, how it is for us today, how, a lot of businesses do English, even in foreign countries. Um, Greek that's the language you need to know to speak to different people. And you also have their culture. So people are adopting a lot of Greek customs, and there's a lot of Greek influence. Now it's also, like I said, very multilingual. And the Greek, you have Latin, Romans, you have the native languages, you have Hebrew, so you have a lot of different languages. It is believed by many scholars that Jesus himself most likely spoke Amharic, if I'm pronouncing it right. Amharic, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it is believed that Jesus actually would have spoken this language in his, daily conversations with people, and he would have been familiar with Hebrew, or could have, read and write Hebrew completely, but he would have been familiar with that language. But for our topic, when it comes to the Bible, he probably, by many scholars, think he read mostly Greek versions of the Bible. He probably read some Hebrew versions, and there could have been the Bible in other languages, but the evidence kind of shows that he's reading, or he's familiar with mostly the Greek versions of the Bible rather than the Hebrew. He does quote Hebrew too. He kind of does both, but from the evidence, it seems that he kind of leans more towards the Greek versions of the Bible more than the original Hebrew versions of the Bible. In fact, if you look at it, and this is what I mean by that, he's relying on the Greek version. Some of the terms that are in the Septuagint or in the Greek versions match more with the New Testament more than it does with the Old Testament. So you can see here, the blue kind of matches. This is the line of the Septuagint, and this is the New Testament, and then this is the Hebrew version, the original Hebrew version. So let's read a passage. This is Hebrews 10:4-10. When Jesus, comes into the world, he says, "A body you have prepared for me. We have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ." And then in the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Old Testament, and this is a prophecy about Jesus in Psalms 39:7. "Sacrifice offering you did not will, but a body you prepared for me." So this is in the Septuagint. But if you read the original Hebrew, it reads like this: "You desired neither sacrifice nor meal offering. You dug ears for me." And that is roughly the section that is talking about here. But you can see how different it is. It's more or less the same thing, but it is clearly different. And Jesus, this passage lines more with the Septuagint. Let's go to another one, the virgin birth, about Jesus' mother Mary. "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." And Emmanuel means God being with us. And then the Septuagint: "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel." And that's from Isaiah. If you look at the original Hebrew, it says, "Behold, the young woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel." And the notable difference is that the Greek version says a virgin, which the New Testament says, but the original Hebrew just says a young woman. It doesn't actually say a virgin, specifically a virgin. It just says a young woman with a child. And we can go on and on. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is, and this is only a small section, there's a lot more passages. I just couldn't fit it onto a slide. But most of the references we see in the New Testament tends to match more with the Greek version of the Bible and the terminology more than the Old Testament. So it either means one or two things. Either Jesus was more familiar with the Greek Testament, or that his apostles, when they wrote down all the stuff Jesus was talking about, they chose to match with the Greek Testament rather than the Hebrew, even if the terminology is different. The apostles were comfortable quoting the Greek version for the most part. So that is a big thing, that's very clear what we can see in the Bible. Any questions about that so far before I go on to the next point? I just wanted to make sure you see the connection between the Greek version and the New Testament. New Testament tends to, more often than not, use the Greek version. So, considering that Jesus tends to rely on the Greek version, why did I say no to he did not use the Septuagint? Why the kind of the contradiction? Why do I say yes, but at the same time, no? Well, the reason I say that is because Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible are not the same as the Septuagint. And make sure you keep this in your head when we go through the rest of the slides. Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible are not the same as the Septuagint, and I'm going to explain why that is. The Septuagint, and this kind of goes to Amalia's question. Here's kind of see the whole picture. This is just the image of the story. But the legend that I read, and there's too much text to put it all on the slide, but the way the Septuagint was made, it is believed that it was done at some point. At some point, the original Septuagint, it was done at some point between I think 300 BC and 1 AD. So sometime between that period, between those years of silence that I talked about last class, between the last prophet and Jesus being born and John appearing. It was somewhere between that period, between Old Testament and between New Testament, they put together this Greek version called the Septuagint. And the legend was that, if you can see right here in the corner, this king right here, this king who was the king of Egypt, a Greek king of Egypt, because remember Alexander conquered all this area, and then after his death, a lot of his generals and people who knew him kind of took over different parts of his empire. So Egypt is ruled by a Greek dynasty, and one of these Greek kings of this dynasty wanted to add books to his library in Alexandria. And what he did was he gathered a lot of men, the 70 people, like we mentioned earlier, how the Septuagint is adapted from the term translation of the 70 people. He took these different scholars and different people and made them come to his palace, and he basically had them write translations of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew text. And that is how you produce the Septuagint, because they all went their separate ways, wrote copies, and then he had Greek copies of the Hebrew Bible because now it was translated, because that originally wasn't translated. And then he said, you know what, y'all come to my palace, I'm gonna make y'all translate all these. That way I have a copy of your scripture. And this was done, like I said, between, I would say somewhere between 300 BC and like the first century, being, first century AD, somewhere in between that time. Most likely, most scholars think, kind of a little bit older. But this, like I said, this is a legend. We're not sure if it's even true, but this comes from a letter of Erasmus that I found, and I could send y'all the link if y'all want it. But that's basically how they believe it came together. But there's important noticeable differences about this Septuagint versus the one we see nowadays. When they did that translation, they only translated the first 5 books of the Bible. So, according to the legend itself, when they translated the original Greek text, the Septuagint, the belief is that they only did the first 5 books, the Torah, the books of the law, was the only thing translated. All these other extra books, like the Apocrypha and things like that, those weren't actually in the original translation of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was basically just the original first 5 books, the book of the law, and then it didn't even include, the later books like the Chronicles and Kings and everything. The belief is the original together form of the Septuagint, those original scrolls were just based on the Greek law, and then over time they added different translations. So that the original Septuagint, if this legend is true, like I said, it is a legend. They don't know if it's actually true. If it's true, it did not include any of the Apocrypha, those books like Tobit and the other books that we see, in the Catholic Bible. They were not included in the original translations, as far as we know. And there, in fact, there was actually no Bible with a full Apocrypha. And when I say Apocrypha, I'm talking about those extra books that we don't include in our Bible, but the Catholics do. We actually don't see a full Bible with a Apocrypha till 300 AD, and that's many centuries after Jesus' death. So the point I'm trying to make is that what Jesus is reading is not a full Septuagint like we see nowadays with those extra Apocrypha books. What Jesus is reading is simply the Greek versions of the Bible based on the Jewish canon. So originally, the Septuagint meant something different to Jesus than it would to us. What Jesus is reading is simply the Hebrew canon, but the Greek version of it. But he is not reading any of these Apocrypha books, these extra books that we see show up later in 300 AD. It's just simply the Bible, Jewish canon, and the Greek versions of it is the most likely scenario. Were there maybe some other books that show up in the, you know, in the Apocrypha or things like? Is it possible that some of those existed around Jesus' time and were being passed around? It's possible, but it's very unlikely that Jesus was actually reading those. The most likely scenario is that he's just simply reading Jewish canon, but maybe the Greek versions on it. Any questions on that so far?
Can you go to the last slide?
Which one? This one?
Yeah. So of these 3 points, which ones did you say are legend?
The story itself is legend, about the way the Septuagint, how it was formed, about these 70, I
Right.
think, elders or scholars. They're not sure if it's true. It comes from a document called the Letter of Aristomus, if I'm pronouncing it right, which I'm probably not. And the belief is that this king of Egypt, and he's a Greek king of Egypt because Egypt was taken over by the Greeks. He got all these scholars together and he made them translate the Bible into Greek, or had them, commission them to translate the Bible into Greek. So he had a version to put in his library. But so the point I'm trying to make is, if this story is true, that means the only version of a Septuagint that Jesus had was a version that existed at Jesus' time, was a version that only included the first 5 books of the Bible. It wasn't a full blown Septuagint like we see later in Christianity. If this story is not true, then that just simply means Jesus is only reading the Hebrew canon, which we read anyway. So the point I'm trying to make is, these Apocrypha books and things like that were not books Jesus would have been reading actively or would have been passed around actively among the Jews. Does that make sense?
So the legend says that that those scribes only translated the first 5 books and didn't include the Apocrypha.
Yes, they only the legend from what I've seen so far is only the book of the law, which is the law of Moses. So the first 5 books.
Okay.
And then they believe over time, they may have translated different books into Greek. And that's why I'm saying that Jesus is reading just, Greek versions of the Bible, because they did, continually to add books or things like that. But when I say add books, I mean like they continue to make more translations of more of the scripture. But the original intent was not to include the Apocrypha. That is a later edition put together from the Catholics, mostly the Catholic Church. But the original Hebrews did not have a working Septuagint with the Apocrypha like we see nowadays, is my point. There's not a strict Septuagint at the time of Jesus. He probably just reading the basic Hebrew Bible, and they just had some Greek versions of it. But their concept of the Septuagint is different than what we think of a Septuagint nowadays. Does that answer your question? I hope it does.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
And then there's no the most modern, I mean not modern, I guess the only real copy, existing copy of those Septuagint manuscripts. I read last night somewhere it said it was from 400, around 400 or AD, I guess. So there's no way to know what was and what wasn't included anyway.
And a lot of the books, and like I said, the original references we have to the Septuagint, most of them are fragments, or they would only have there would be a few doctrine, a few scrolls here or there, but it wasn't like a full blown book, like we think of it nowadays. Like, because originally they're reading multiple scrolls, so you have a collection of the books of the Bible, but they're on separate scrolls. And when we talk about the Septuagint, most of the references we see are usually individual scrolls. It's not a full blown book. You just see, hey, this is a scroll of Isaiah that's in Greek, or this is a scroll of Genesis that's in Greek. So you'll see fragments like that. But as a collected book, a body of work, we don't really see that until a lot later, like you're mentioning, 400 AD, a lot later after Jesus' time. So they're not sure on how prevalent these apocryphal books are. What is clear that was the Hebrew canon, the Hebrew scriptures, the 24 books we read, that was already well established. We know, and we're actually going to go into it, Jesus referencing them and talking about them, those were well established. The Apocrypha, the reason is very problematic is because a lot of those, we don't know how well they were cycled between the Jews. We don't know if they were even considered canon, and the evidence shows that they probably weren't considered scripture. Some of them may have read it just, as simple history or as nice additions, but as scripture, we don't have any evidence that it was a part of it originally. What we do have evidence is those first 24 books, what we read nowadays, that is clearly evident that those were already well established by Jesus' time. And Jesus references them when we get into the evidence about that. But any more comments on that or any more questions? And those are great comments, by the way. All right, let's continue on some of the evidence for this. Why I say Jesus only read Greek versions based on Bible and not the the Apocrypha and things like that. If we look in Luke chapter 24, and I actually put it on the screen this time, I'll have to look at my phone. But Luke chapter 24, 24, verse 44. And this is Jesus talking about, the prophecy he's fulfilling. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." So Jesus mentions, when Jesus says, things that are prophesied about me, he talks about three different bodies of work. He talks about the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. What is Jesus referring to? He is referring to the Tanakh, which is Hebrew scripture, the Torah, which represents law, the Nevi'im, which represents prophet, and the ketuvim, which represents writings or psalms, like he mentions in that scripture. So Jesus appears to be, when Jesus refers to the Old Testament, he's always referring to the Jewish organization of the Old Testament, which is the Tanakh, the Torah, which is law, the Nevi'im, prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is writings. A lot of the, like I said before, I don't know if it was last class or class before, or the class before that, the Apocrypha, a lot of those books come outside of these original documents. They are in that in-between period. And Jesus never, reference them as scripture. He only references the Tanakh as scripture. He's going off based off the Jewish organization of the Bible and not the Greek. Even though he reads Greek and he quotes Greek a lot, he regards the scriptures based on what the Jewish believe, the Jewish canon is, and not what these other books are or things like that. He never refers to. He always refers to the way Jewish people see things. And now if we go to Matthew chapter 23, verse 35, it essentially says the same thing. And so upon you will come all righteousness that has been shed on earth. And just to give you context, Jesus is talking about he's talking to the Pharisees and he's criticizing them. He said, you should know this stuff and you're messing up my law. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So Jesus was saying, like he says, you've been hurting our people since Abel, and Abel is, character from the story of Genesis, Cain and Abel. Abel was murdered by his brother. He says, so he references the book of Genesis, but then he says Zechariah. And if you're familiar with the book of Zechariah, that appears at near the end of the Old Testament. So if you look at it right here, you see Genesis is right here and Zechariah is right here. So when Jesus refers to scripture, he always refers to it in the context between Genesis from the law of Moses and to the minor prophets, what we call minor prophets in the way we organize it. Zechariah, which is towards the end of the Bible. I think he's a contemporary of Malachi. I can't remember if he lived a little bit before him. But the point I'm trying to make is that Jesus always refers to scripture as the way the Hebrews refer to scripture, which is that Genesis through Malachi. All the references Jesus makes are always between this time period and between this body of work. The Apocrypha goes outside of it, and it's never really quoted by Jesus. Or there's some similarities, but there's no reason to believe that Jesus is reading those books or actively quoting those books. It's always the way the Jews organize and how the Jews believe it. So the conclusion from all the evidence and from everything, from the study, the conclusion I get is that the Septuagint in Jesus' time was closer to Hebrew scripture than in the latter Christian era. So what Jesus is reading is Greek versions of the Bible, and a lot of the Greek versions of the Bible are adapted from the Jewish canon. But later, at some point, the Christians decided when we made our Bibles, and I'm using Christian as a broad term, when Christians started to print the Bible, they included those books which were not really a part of the original canon, which is why they were rejected later, and they were very controversial even in the time that they had them in the books. And I'm actually going to get into that next week when I talk about the controversy about the Apocrypha and why do us in the West, why do we reject it? Why do they still have it in their Bibles? And we'll talk a lot about that. But the misconception is that when they hear the term Septuagint, they believe that Jesus is reading the same thing that exists nowadays. And the evidence shows that is not. Jesus is not reading Apocrypha. He's not reading all these different books. The Septuagint are simply a few Greek versions of the Old Testament that a lot of the people were reading because of the language barrier, but it wasn't a full-blown body of work like we see nowadays. Any comments on that or any questions? I hope that's pretty clear. And that was all on my slides.